Thanks everyone for coming. Thank you to Caesar and to Laura for organizing this. It's a great pleasure for me to be with you tonight to talk about scoping nuclear weapons choices in an age of existential threat. What I'll do is I'll share with you several findings of the team, the Nuclear Knowledges program that I've created at Sciences Po in Paris in 2017. Nuclear Knowledges is the first independent scholarly program in France that focuses on the nuclear phenomenon. And at that point, you're like, wait, that sounds potentially very subjective and or self-serving. Okay, so let's clarify what I mean by independent scholarship. The program is essentially defined by a notion of independence which is clear and easily verifiable. The criteria are the following. It's nonpartisan, it's transparent about its funding sources, it refuses any funding that carries conflicts of interest, and I'm very strict about that. That means we refuse funding from nuclear weapons states or entities that manufacture the weapons, as well as entities that have a set preferred nuclear weapons policy. And the idea is we do that on the basis of scholarship on other areas of socio-political action where it's been established that analysis funded by funders that carry a conflict of interest produce kind of biases in the outcome. So we thought until proven that this effect doesn't apply to the realm of nuclear weapons related research, we should apply a precautionary principle. The commitment of the Nuclear Knowledges program is to create the possibility of a choice. Not to advocate for a particular choice, but to create the possibility of a choice between different nuclear weapons policies that would be consistently justified. Because what we will see is that existing policies do not match existing public justifications. And if you are curious about why we're not starving and who's funding this, some of it is written on the slides and the rest you can ask me about. So beyond the rule of prudence, one of the recent findings in a published article is precisely that we've found something totally unsurprising, which is that what applies to most other spheres also applies to the nuclear weapons policy realm, which is if you look at the top 45 think tanks in the nuclear weapons policy realm, you can show that essentially funding carrying conflicts of interest produce biases through direct censorship, that's rare, self-censorship, or filtering of particular voices. And this is documented, so in a peer-reviewed publication based on a study of the flows of resources, but also interviews with workers at those think tanks, as well as funders of those think tanks. Beyond that, what we do is to reassess accepted claims when we discover that those accepted claims do not match available evidence. So here I'm going to show you two examples. One is an article I did with my colleague Sébastien Philippe on the credibility of the French nuclear arsenal, which we call la force de frappe, in particular the first generation of this arsenal. And so the assumption is that we know when this so-called small nuclear arsenal became credible. Interestingly, when you look at the French scholarship and you look at the evidence base those claims are grounded in, you realize that those are almost exclusively French sources, meaning you assess the credibility of a nuclear weapon program on the basis of what the French want it to be. So, it's kind of the sincerity of my desire to have a flying carpet doesn't help the carpet to take off, right? So what we do is simply to create the ad hoc interdisciplinarity that allows you to look for adequate evidence to this question. So that's why I teamed up with Sébastien, who's a nuclear engineer and physicist, who managed to do an assessment of the technical performance of the first generation of the Forster Frappe. And so we managed to show that literally this wasn't capable to achieve the mission that was assigned to it. And then we did historical work looking at UK, US sources, as well as some Russian documents, to show whether the arsenal was perceived as credible. And we discovered that at least up to 1974, the French nuclear arsenal wasn't credible. So that's a type of interdisciplinary design to reassess established claims. Another example is the work Sébastien did on the health and environmental effects of French nuclear weapons testing in Polynesia. That focused on over 2,000 pages of archival documents that was first released in 2013, coupled with modeling of the trajectory of the radioactive cloud to be able to actually reassess the level of contamination or the level of radioactive exposure that essentially traveled with the cloud. In what Sébastien and his colleagues found is that over 90,000 Polynesians were exposed to a level of radiation that would allow them to claim compensation within the rule of existing French law. There's a 2010 law, and according to this law, over 90,000 people would be allowed to claim compensation, and that essentially was not known until this was published. So those are the references for the two articles I'm mentioning. So they are just typical of what independent scholarship, or the ethos of independent scholarship, allows you to do, which is to ask questions about assessing the effects of particular policies or claims about their success on the basis of an adequate interdisciplinary research design. Now, for this lecture, I'm going to essentially do three things. One is rethink, therefore the title, why and how nuclear weapons policy choices are scoped. In the scholarship I read, which is mostly history and international relations, the scope of public policy is assumed to be defined by this list here. The material features of the present day security situation, lessons from the past, categories mobilized by experts which are legitimate because they match objective realities, i.e. the assumption that we need a specialized nuclear language because of the specificity of nuclear realities. You would not otherwise talk about survivable second strike capabilities. And finally, it's assumed that the experts are expressing and translating those realities in a neutral fashion. So one of the things we will do throughout the lecture is revisit and adjust those scoping parameters. The follow-up kind of intervention is to reconnect nuclear weapons policymaking with democracy. Because there is a common claim in nuclear armed democracies, I'm mostly thinking about my own country, France, here the UK, in the United States, that either there is no serious alternative to existing nuclear weapons policies, or that the ones that we're currently operating under are obviously the best ones. And you'll see the talk will be structured according to the four arguments below, which are four common claims that produce this sense of absence of alternative. There would be an iron law of history that would say the history of the nuclear age is a history of proliferation. Therefore, the best you can do is contain it, slow it down, manage it, but this is essentially how history works. That obviously fundamentally constrains choices. Second claim is that alternatives would be superfluous. We could simply declare victory because our most fundamental goal has been achieved. Our most fundamental goal was to avoid unwanted nuclear explosions, and we have. So why change anything? Third claim is that nuclear weapons policy is democratic already since the public overall supports it. In France, we have a word for it. We call it le consensus. Fourth argument, there is anyway an adequate debate among experts, and that's what experts are for. They are producing the best possible policies. So the four segments of the lecture are going to be assessments of those four claims. And then at this point, if you wonder why did I end up in this room, I realize, and I'm grateful to Caesar for inviting me. Therefore, the third kind of intervention is going to be an intervention in the scholarship on existential risk. Obviously, on the nuclear weapons related risk specifically, so you'll see things about findings on the causes of avoidance of unwanted nuclear explosions, sources of nuclear risk, and suggested modes of engagement with citizens on this issue. We've talked with colleagues who are working on risk communication. But beyond that, I think what the team has done so far allows us to make a broader point about an assumption that I commonly read in the risk literature, which is the knowledge deficit model, right? It's like people don't act the way they should act because they don't know. And one of the findings really of the nuclear world is that knowing accurately the possibility of nuclear weapons related disaster isn't sufficient for you to believe in what you know. So literally, knowledge is insufficient. And we're going to engage in not just material pressures, but also modes of imaginability as requirements to get to a policy that is in sync with what we know. And then comes the issue of how do we handle timescapes? You'll see we're going to talk about nuclear weapon states currently engaged in processes of modernization or life extension of existing nuclear arsenals all the way to 2050 to 2090. So just by saying that, you realize that a presentist approach would be unsatisfactory because people who are not born yet and who are not participating in the discussion we are having now or have had in the last decade about those processes will still live under the shadow of those weapon systems towards the end of the 21st century. But at some point between now and 2090, there will be a decision point. So they will have an opportunity to engage and possibly reverse what has been done. So it seems to me that the lifetime of those weapons, allows us to avoid several of the traps of long-termism, one of which would be to simply treat the current generation as insignificant, because that would also kind of too easily dismiss the fact that people living now, it's not a given that they're going to avoid nuclear war. It's far from a given. And actually in the existential risk literature, the nuclear risk for the current generation is gestured towards but not treated consistently. So that would be my proposal, to avoid both presentism and long-termism in the thinking about the nuclear risk. And so, as you'll see, the final bit is to show that it's possible to democratize the governance of existential risk. So for those of you who are not familiar with the nuclear world, I thought I would just have one slide to make sure that we're all on the same page. I apologize to those who know all of this already. This will be quick. So the fundamental point I want to make is that nuclear explosions remain possible, simply. And this is because we have over 12,000 nuclear weapons in the world. They are located in 9 nuclear weapons possessing states, plus 5 hosts, which essentially have US nuclear weapons on their soil. We may have 6 hosts, since the Belarusian president is now claiming that they've received Russian tactical nuclear weapons. All of this is happening in the northern hemisphere, something I should also say. Why am I claiming that nuclear weapons explosions remain possible? There are many reasons for that. One of them simply is that existing nuclear weapon states practice a policy that they call nuclear deterrence. This policy requires preparing for using those weapons and communicating willingness to use them in particular circumstances. So that alone requires to keep the possibility of use open. That's pretty obvious. And the doctrines are clear in this respect. NATO, as well as most nuclear weapon states, do not have a no first use policy. The only two that do are China and India. And the fact that President Biden campaigned on a no first use pledge in 2019 didn't materialize into 2022 US nuclear posture review. Another sign is that not all the nuclear weapon states have signed the protocols of the nuclear weapon free zone treaties that would, by which they would commit not to target those places. Another reason why this possibility remains is simply the criterion of force sizing of the US and Soviet and then Russian nuclear arsenals. Those arsenals are not sized by the only requirements of nuclear deterrence. An additional set of requirements includes what we call damage limitation should deterrence fail. What does that mean? That means if deterrence fails, we should be able to target and destroy as many enemy nuclear weapons as possible before they are launched at us. That obviously opens additional paths to use and turns any nuclear weapon state into a direct target. Additional evidence: war games and crisis simulations have frequently led to the use of nuclear weapons. And in 2019, I was at a Hoover meeting with General Hyten, the head of Strategic Command, and he said, I asked him about war games, and he said explicitly, they always end badly. And by badly, I mean they end with global thermonuclear war. Fred Kaplan has an example during the Obama year where when the deputy members of the NSC simulate a situation in which Russia invades a Baltic country and uses nuclear weapons, does the US respond with nuclear weapons? The deputies do not respond with nuclear weapons, but the principals, when they redo the simulation, did ask for the use of nuclear weapons. So let's not fall for wishful thinking, assuming that this is not possible, because this hasn't happened yet. Now, timescale. I've told you already, the modernization processes take us to the end of the century. If we were to go the other way, physicists Ziamian and Moritz Kutt have shown that we could, without any progress, dismantle everything in 10 years. Meaning, we have to think about this for at least another decade. Now, let's go back to the 4 arguments that I announced earlier that create the illusion that there's no alternative to change. The first one, the iron law of proliferation. What is this? It's the idea that we call proliferation the spread of nuclear weapons to additional countries. So that's only one layer of proliferation, right? It's not the increase of existing arsenal, it's simply the spread to other entities. And those are usually leaders that we love to hate. And then we end up with graphs like that create a sense of inevitability, right? This is the number of, this is the acquisition of nuclear weapons by new states over time. So that creates a sense that, oh, you see, this is inevitable. Okay, let's look. One of the findings of my book is that, contrary to expert claims, horizontal proliferation is at historically low levels. And the focus on proliferation overlooks the absence of nuclear desire or I should say desire for nuclear weapons. Here I'm going to talk, so when I say nuclear for the rest of this lecture, I'm talking about the weapons. I'm not going to make claims about energy. And the discourse of proliferation obscures the fact that the permanent members of the UN Security Council have played key roles in fueling nuclear desire and spreading nuclear technology while invisibilizing their responsibility. You may have noticed that originally this phenomenon was called dissemination or spread, which, focuses implicitly on the disseminator or the spreader. If you rename it proliferation, it becomes a self-begetting phenomenon, and then the problems become the one who receives. Okay. One way of substantiating my claim is to look at what would our world look like if the Cold War trends had continued. If the trends of the first 4 decades of the Cold War had continued, we would be in a world with over 16 nuclear weapon states. Luckily, this is one of the few good news of this talk, we're not in that world. We're in the world of the right, where we have, essentially, roughly 9 nuclear weapon states. Let's look further. Regardless of the criterion you choose to assess proliferation, you can show that post-Cold War, it has slowed down. Let's stick to the one that we have here. Let's look at the red line. What the red line shows is that the pace was literally 1 new nuclear weapon state on average every 5 years during the Cold War. Post-Cold War, only 1 new nuclear weapon state in 32 years and counting, North Korea. The one state which started a program in the 1950s. And then you're going to say, wait. India and Pakistan tested in 1998. Sure. But I would say this is a category error, because they did, but I think it's reasonable to say proliferation is a concern because we're worried about those weapons going off, right? If that's the case, if you look at Pakistani and Indian perceptions, they take the arsenal of the other side as already significant in the late 80s. So what I've done is I've recast the Pakistani and the Indian cases as late Cold War cases. Second criterion would simply be to say, okay, let's look at the time since the last newcomer in the nuclear weapons club. North Korea tested in 2006 the first time, then again in 2009. If we take 2006, that means we're 16 years after the last newcomer. Never in the history of the nuclear age have we had that much time without a newcomer. Another sign is the hatchet part of the graph, which is the number of ongoing nuclear weapon programs. Sure, if you survey people, they worry, and we should, about the North Korean program and about what's happening in Iran. But let's not forget that at no point have we had so few nuclear weapons programs, knowing that we have better detection capability than ever before. And yet another criterion, which is often missing in those assessments, if we care about proliferation, once again, because those weapons can go off, then the weapons that are located on the territory of allies, they can also accidentally explode or be targeted or be stolen or be used by terrorists. So we need to factor them in. This is the light gray part of the graph. And you can see that from the late 70s onwards, the trend is going down. Again, if Belarus actually hosts, we're going to go back from 5 to 6. but this is still a trend downward. So first thing, let's not assume that post-Cold War proliferation is accelerating, as we've heard for 3 decades. Essentially, the exact opposite is plausible. At this point, if you find me annoying, you could say, he's just cherry-picking the evidence. I'm actually doing exactly the opposite, because I only looked at the states that were at some point interested in nuclear weapons. If you look at the entire set of states that are members of the United Nations, you see the graph on the right, which essentially dramatizes the trends I was suggesting earlier. So what I'm suggesting here is that the proliferation-disarmament dichotomy wrongly assumes an inherent desire for nuclear weapons, and it forgets that renunciation is more frequent than maintained proliferation at 3 levels among all states, because at least 143 of those states have never had any nuclear weapons activities, and we can talk more about it in the Q&A if you'd like. Absence of capacity doesn't explain the phenomenon. Among states with nuclear weapons activities, 30 out of 40 actually gave up, and among host states, 15 states ceased hosting and did not acquire nuclear weapons. The other correction to this assumption is this. So what this graph shows you is 2 things. One, no nuclear weapon state today, none, has reached that status without the help of at least one permanent member of the UN Security Council, and no permanent member of the UN Security Council has a perfectly clean proliferation track record. Some of those data points are findings of colleagues on the team. I'm happy to tell you more about any of them. But those are the 2 points, right? So let's not assume the universality of desire, and let's not forget the role of the P5 in spreading the technology and spreading the discourse of the value of those weapons. Second argument that is commonly mobilized to say we don't need to change anything, or we don't need to think about alternative nuclear weapons policies because we've succeeded at avoiding unwanted nuclear explosions, is what I would call an illusion of perfect control. Because at least since the 60s, I'm collecting a very long list, but I'm probably missing several, of military and policy officials, as well as officials from international organizations, who have claimed that in particular instances, what avoided unwanted nuclear explosions is luck. So this is famously, Robert McNamara in Errol Morris's documentary, where he says at the end we lucked out. It was luck that prevented nuclear war. I'm not saying that we should take those claims for granted. I'm saying it's worth observing 2 things. One, that of the officials who make claims about how did we avoid those things, none has shifted from the luck camp to the control camp, and that the people who are claiming luck, including Mr. McNamara, are making declarations against interest. Mr. McNamara would benefit much more from saying we came out okay of the Cuban Missile Crisis because of how great a Secretary of Defense I was, which is literally how he managed his entire career throughout. So those are declarations against interest that at least deserve serious analysis on our part. And commonly, the scholarship pays tribute to it, but then dismisses it as either impossible to know, but then if it's impossible to know, you can't treat unknowable as insignificant. That would be a methodological mistake. So what we did is we simply produced a distinctive definition of luck and the modes of luck, I'm happy to tell you more about it if you're interested, as the flip side of control, and cases in which the causes of absence of unwanted nuclear explosions cannot be reduced to the success of control practices. Then we produce empirical evidence that indeed luck was necessary to avoid unwanted nuclear explosions in specific episodes. We also offer a typology and illustration of the modes of denial of luck. And those findings have been validated by colleagues in history, Marty Sherwin, or the late Marty Sherwin, I should say, and Serhii Plokhy, but inconsistently treated in security studies. They essentially cite the work, and then once they cite it, then they treat the problem as solved, and then they go back to a control framework. I find that this consideration for luck is missing in the X-risk literature, which frequently assumes nuclear peace so far, or assumes that perfect implementation of control practices would have sufficed to avoid nuclear catastrophe. And one of the findings is that we know this not to be correct. Let me say one more thing. The role of luck in the published work we've done is most likely an underestimation, because it relies on the availability of archives. So it relies on what we found in the US, the UK, private archives, also in France. But assuming that our overall assessment of the role of luck is complete would be to say, in those 2.5 country cases we had, over 30 instances, and in all the other nuclear weapon states which are much more opaque about their nuclear past, there was none. That would be a massively optimistic assumption, all the more so as if you think about the most studied crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis, how long did it take for us to understand the role of luck and go past the Kennedy legend of perfect control? Over 3 decades. So the other reason why my assumption of luck is most likely, bless you, to be an underestimation is simply because we don't have access to the archives of most nuclear weapon states, and we're blind anyway to the possible cases of luck in the last, I would say, 2 to 3 decades. Third reason why we are not supposed to think about alternatives, or actually there is no alternative, is that the policy is supported by consensus already. There are pretty substantive methodological problems with claims like that and with the existing surveys. The first is that the question is very rarely asked. And when it is asked, and here I've looked particularly closely at how it was done in France by the communication department of the Ministry of the Armies, the question incorporates the assumptions of official policy. So it assumes that nuclear weapons threats do deter, that they deter everything that you want them to deter, that non-nuclear threats would not deter. There's no discussion about the risks, there's no discussion about the cost. So if you incorporate all of that, what you measure is not support for the policy, it's the effect of a communication campaign. The problem is that French experts uncritically repeat those findings as showing consensus, and then essentially people in the English language repeat the only one thing that has been translated that in most cases says that. So what we did is simply we took the same pollster and we conducted our own surveys. So we started by asking kind of similar questions, but by simply removing those kind of obviously biased assumptions. And we found levels of active support for government decision to be very low. If you think of support as simply non-opposition, you have higher numbers, but still not a majority. But then more interestingly, and we're going to go back to that when we talk about risk communication, a meaningful way of conducting those surveys is not to ask respondents, what do you think about this policy? But instead, what do you think of what the policy requires of you? So for instance, supporting nuclear deterrence means accepting as a taxpayer that your taxes fund the national nuclear arsenal. It means that as a citizen, you accept to delegate your authority to the head of state so that the president will implement the national nuclear doctrine on your behalf. It also means that because you understand the rules of the nuclear deterrence relationship, you accept that your country is an immediate target of the Russian nuclear arsenal. If you ask that, the level of support that you find is really low. So I'm not telling you at all that we've discovered that the French and British public are secretly anti-nuclear. No. But I think there is an interesting finding there, which is the one attitude that gets a majority or almost is a sense that citizens cannot participate, bless you, cannot participate in this discussion, and they feel a sense of lack of legitimacy to engage. So the claim that these policies have gathered support mischaracterizes the fact that they've produced citizens' disempowerment. That was the third argument. The fourth argument, at this point, you could say, yeah, but Benoît, look, we have all sorts of experts who are there to produce the alternative. And there is an adequate debate among them. So I would say no, because most experts in France and in the mainstream of policy analysis accept key assumptions of the proliferation paradigm that I've deconstructed earlier, and they consistently make three methodological mistakes. The first one is simply that they accept judgments or normative assessments or categories of the official discourse as premises. So they accept to call the British nuclear arsenal the deterrent. If you start there, you've already embarked on assumption that what the desire for deterrence turns into a systematic success. You essentially avoid having to assess when it works and when it doesn't. So you see, first mistake is to incorporate categories and judgments of official policy into the analysis as if they were neutral categories. The second mistake is to treat intended effects as actual effects. So in that case, the deterrent effect is the intended effect. You need to prove that it's the actual effect. You can't assume this away. And the third assumption is that often experts massively underestimate two features of the nuclear language. One is reversification, the fact that in nuclear speak, like in finance, sometimes words mean the opposite of what they would mean in normal parlance, and that policy actors navigate contradictions. They use contradictions as a policy resource. And experts write as though, of course, this is not contradictory. That's a fundamental mischaracterization of this discursive universe. But that produces the absence of alternatives, and this absence of alternatives in turn makes experts unaccountable for being wrong, and incentivizes them to continue, which is why the misjudgment on proliferation is actually continuing to this day. You could say, yeah, but the public likes it that way. Does it? Did anyone ask? It turns out that if you ask, the public is not massively in favor of delegating this issue to experts. So we did a small survey of European population in June 2018 in nuclear weapon states, hosting states. And what you see in the A graph is that you don't have a majority of people saying that they appreciate not to have to worry about this issue because it's handled by experts, except in the Netherlands. Okay, you could say Belgium is close to majority, not quite. But what's striking is the B and the C, where there is a demand for consultation and actually a demand for choice. We've replicated that survey in 2019 and confirmed this finding was a small experiment where we tried to prime respondents by adding to the survey as a citizen in a democracy for half of the respondents and not adding it to the others. And it turned out that the addition doesn't distort fundamentally the finding. So I'll conclude. What I hope I've convinced you of is that key justifications of existing nuclear weapons policies do not hold. And as a result, alternatives, hence democratic choices, are possible. And so then, what would consistent justifications for relying on nuclear weapons for the next 70 years look like? Horizontal proliferation is inevitable? No. Continuation of perfect control? No. Actually, the consistent justification would be to say we will be as lucky as we've been in the past, and the logic of fear of nuclear retaliation will produce prudence and not escalation, which psychological studies are now showing to us that we're too commonly conflating fear and anger is escalatory, whereas fear could trigger kind of prudence. So it's a bet on being as lucky as we've been in the past and on fear working in particular ways for the next 70 years. Can we simply say, yeah, it's justified by democracy? Not quite, because of the limited information so far in absence of choice of the key over the key policies. There is another argument which is commonly mobilized, which is the idea that it's a really heavy, tragic burden to be the head of state in a nuclear weapon state, and they carry this responsibility. It turns out that no, a consistent justification would be to say this is a distributed responsibility along the chain of command, because you can rely on someone to disobey only when need be. And what's interesting there is that in situations of crisis, when you have people who are asked what would happen, they reveal that this is their preference. In Congress, General Robert Kaler in 2017 revealed exactly that. He said, no, in case of a crazy order, someone down the chain of command would disobey. So that shows you, in a way, this is consistent. But this is a system that assumes that disobedience will happen only when need be. Here, and this is where I reconnect with the X-risk community, most of what I've said so far could be criticized for being presentist. So this is the one moment when I say really imagine futures play a key constitutive role in scoping conceivable policies. And there are 4 conceivable future enemies. In most of the nuclear weapons policy debate, think about the first 2 and not of the others. So the first face of the enemy is an enemy that can be deterred only by nuclear threats. Okay, so then in the face of that enemy, and usually the assumption is they can be deterred only by nuclear threats that are doable with the arsenal that we have or that we want to build. Second face of the enemy is an enemy that can be deterred by nuclear threats or other threats. Okay, then we can start to think about which capabilities could be used to accomplish missions that are so far assigned to nuclear weapons. But let's think about other conceivable futures over the next 70 years. One is an enemy that cannot be deterred by nuclear threats or at all. So we usually think about the crazy leader, but how about existential non-nuclear perils? if we think about 2100, catastrophic climate change, catastrophic collapse of biodiversity, if our civilization is destroyed by those, are we going to call that a success of nuclear deterrence? Or does the claim that nuclear deterrence has succeeded require that our countries remain inhabitable? Then there is a fourth type, which is an enemy that has become able to hack existing nuclear weapons, which would obviously massively decrease and possibly negate their value. I'm not making any oracular pronouncements at all. I don't know what the future holds. I'm simply saying most of the policy debate, instead of clarifying which imagined future they rely on, they actually rely on the first two and start from the capabilities they have or the capabilities that they want to draw the face of the enemy. And I don't think this is wise. In all four scenarios above, assume that unwanted nuclear explosions will not happen during this entire time in the arsenals of our countries, as well as in those of all the countries that target ours or could produce scenarios impacting it, such as a small nuclear war between India and Pakistan producing a nuclear winter that would lead some of Europe to starve. The importance of those imagined futures, I would say, is crucial. For those of you who focus on the climate threat, you will have noticed that the future scenarios do not talk about nuclear weapons. So I went and asked, do you assume that they've been abolished? No, we don't assume that. So what do you assume? And they don't assume much, but they simply do not factor in nuclear weapons. Similarly, in the nuclear weapons policy community, catastrophic climate change and planetary boundaries are treated as they exist, but they are treated as manageable. So there is some sort of a mutual blindness where everyone assumes that either you die from their preferred existential threat or you survive. But there are many more ways of dying, and the point of X-risk research should be to really avoid those mutual blindness, which is why in the nuclear realm I'm bringing up the role of imagined futures. Just one example here on why imagined futures matter. Here I'm going to simply give you an example of bets on the future that facilitate accepting status quo as it is. If you say a non-nuclear disaster as unacceptable as a nuclear one will hit before a catastrophic deterrence failure, and if you assume the nuclear weapons are needed before a catastrophic failure of deterrence, if you assume a technological revolution, such as ballistic missile defense becoming credible, will take place before a catastrophic deterrence failure and reduce the effects of this failure, then status quo becomes massively more acceptable, just because of those assumptions. So overall, the further you push nuclear weapons disasters into the future, the less destructive you assume them to be, the easier it is to accept status quo as meaning security. So that's why it's crucial to clarify all those assumptions about imagined futures. Getting to the end, really, you remember this is where we started, and what we saw is that the scope of nuclear weapons policy choices in the end is not defined by material features of the present security situation, but rather by imagined and imaginable futures mobilized by planning institutions. Sure, lessons from the past do matter, but they depend massively on available and accepted knowledge. Remember what we discussed about learning from luck and the resistance to learn from luck. The categories mobilized are mobilized, but they are inherited from the first 20 years of the nuclear age, and they allow inconsistencies and contradictions. Experts, as a community, do not express and translate those realities in a neutral fashion. Instead, they are not affected by contradiction if this contradiction is commonly practiced by the whole community. They are having a performative mission. That is, Deterrence experts are there to project the fact that the policy works. I'm happy to give you detailed evidence. And they are dependent on their professional positions when they make those claims. So I would say those are the parameters of scoping of nuclear weapons policy choices, and they are quite different from what the existing scholarship assumes. And this neglects how challenging it is to believe in the possibility of nuclear disasters, even when it is established. And that's the finding of a 2-year interview campaign where I spoke to policy-making elites, military people, across nuclear weapons policy preferences. And this challenge of believing in the possibility of disaster is shared. Overall, to think about all of this, it struck me over the last 6 years that the concept of vulnerability, because it allows for a material and an epistemic dimension, provides a productive starting point. And that calls for breaking away from the silos of nuclear security research, obviously, but also incorporating nuclear weapons related vulnerabilities, both material and epistemic, in the treatment of existential risk, reopening the discussion about identifying the producer of this X risk and democratizing its governance by refusing the illusion of absence of alternatives. The one point I wanted to make to close is that if we're talking about democracy, then we're talking about engaging citizens. And so what we're facing, this is a conversation I was having with Lara over the last few days, we're facing citizens who feel that either nuclear weapons related disasters do happen, then they die, there's not much they can do about it, or it doesn't happen during their lifetime, and then they're much better off immediately forgetting whatever this guy with a Greek name has said. So I would say the angle to engage is to say that would be acceptable if you could choose whether or not to be affected by nuclear weapons policies, but you do not have that choice. Because even if a catastrophe doesn't happen, you are already affected. Because as I suggested earlier, as a citizen in a nuclear weapon state or hosting states, you're already asked to support the policy by delegating your authority to the head of state. You're already asked as a taxpayer to actually pay your taxes and support the arsenal. And you're already asked implicitly to accept being targeted. So that's a way of speaking, I would say, to the citizens to say, you don't have the choice to not be affected. You have a choice to be active or passive in the face of that existential risk. And then we can talk to you about what we can provide for you to be more active. And so if you found anything of interest in what I've said so far, I just want to restate once more that this only became possible thanks to a strict commitment to independent research. And I thank you for your patience and look forward to questions, comments.
Thank you, Benoît. I've already forgotten all the instructions Laura gave me about where I should stand. Should I stand here? Is that right?
Yeah, and then I'll move back
Okay,
to questions.
great. Thank you, Benoît. Think about your questions or comments or anything over the next minute or two, because you can switch off around what I'm going to say. But how do you sleep at night, Benoît? Is a question we all get asked, but you know he's already demolished the answers I give, so I'd be interested in that question. One of the futures you had up was that states would be able to hack each other. It's a present situation. The General Accounting Office in 2013 said that the US could easily be hacked, and they knew that because they'd done a study of their own nuclear weapon systems and those of all their allies and adversaries, and they stated in bold public that they could hack quite easily. The issue that I'm losing sleep over at the moment is the Ukraine war, where we have a situation of both sides using escalation as an active and deliberate strategy. And when you have nuclear weapons involved, escalation and nuclear weapons don't fit very well. But what I am experiencing is a lot of the Ukrainians I talk to making significant basic strategic errors. Ideas such as, if you have nuclear weapons, then you are 100% protected from nuclear threats and nuclear blackmail, which clearly is not the case. We've seen nuclear threats and blackmail over several years. So tackling these really fundamental strategic assumptions and trying to undermine them is a really big job. And it's a really big job, I think, probably beyond the scope of your lecture, but I think I'd be interested in any responses you have. And then my final question prod is it the public or is it the political parties? Because usually we talk about political parties, and certainly in France and Britain, in fact pretty much everywhere, that seems like a hopeless activity based on the experience that you and I have had over the decades. So how do you get traction beyond just individuals in public opinion? So those are some questions. And then start putting your hands up, attracting my attention whilst he's on.
Okay, thank you, Paul. So I want to focus on the Ukraine element. In particular, I think it's crucial in relation to what I said about the pace and drivers of proliferation to not give credit to this one idea that circulates that if Ukraine had kept nuclear weapons, they would not have been invaded. I suppose you've heard this because it's kind of common parlance now. And we have students in the room, so you know what kind of a reasoning this is. This is a counterfactual claim, right? It's if we change one thing in the past, so in 1994, the Rada decides differently, Ukraine doesn't return the part of the the part of the Soviet and then Russian arsenal that was stationed on its soil and keeps it. And then they assume that would have produced the fact that in 2014 or 2022, they're not invaded. And so if you've touched counterfactual methodology, you know that this is a laughable way of implementing it. Because that assumes that we change something in 1994 and then assume that for 20 or 28 years, it has zero effect. And then we can turn the switch and now it has an effect. That's not how you do counterfactual thinking. You just trace back, okay, if you do that, what would it change? Let's look. This choice would have had massive consequences. From 1994 to 2014, the European Union and the US gave Ukraine $30 billion of aid, which would have been obviously lost. Then that assumes that they had the capability to maintain the arsenal, and they didn't. Over 10 years, Ukrainian President Kuchma assumed that the maintenance of the arsenal would have cost $200 billion, i.e. 3 times the cost of Ukrainian health and education policies combined. So then you realize that they didn't have a source of tritium gas, which would have been necessary to keep the warheads operational. Meaning, in 2014 or 2022, the Ukraine you would have seen is not the Ukraine we know.
It's the key thing here is tritium has a very short half-life, so it doesn't last very long.
Great. Yes. And the second bit is that was not possible anyway. Simply because only a very small minority of Ukrainian MPs wanted that, because their memory was the nuclear phenomenon is Chernobyl, and they thought of nuclear weapons as weapons for use. And maybe even more importantly, Russia had a non-proliferation obligation, which would have incentivized it to take the weapons back, most likely with the support of the US and the international community. And even if they hadn't done that, they had the ability to sabotage the arsenal before leaving, which means that they knew that that wasn't an arsenal that was deterring anything. So this entire claim is massively dangerous because it attributes an illusion that, as you said, Paul, that nuclear weapons are a perfect protection, in that they are more desirable than they should be. So it's crucial, if we want to avoid another wave of proliferation, to not fuel the desire for those weapons by propagating ideas that are simply overstating the benefits of the weapons. I'm not saying that they don't have any. I'm saying if we can show that those benefits don't exist, let's not pretend that they do.
So we have a question over here, and secondly, question here.
I just, you know, the landscape of the use of nuclear weapons, you know, some of those uses being in the ether, the metaphor of waving a loaded gun around in a room, you know, negotiating, but then also, you know, there's reports of small tactical nukes being used, and people, you know, there's the fear of it becoming more casual. And I want to know if you distinguish between making nukes smaller and more casual, and the use of very large nukes leading to a very quick end, if there's any intersection between them as well.
It's hard to answer quickly. I will do my best. The first point I would want to make is to say existing nuclear weapons arsenals, they vary massively in their destructive capability. So within the US arsenal, for instance, you have destructive capacity from 1 to over 5,000, literally. But we shouldn't fall for the idea that there is such a thing as small nuclear weapons, because if we go with, you know, talking about small assumes that there's no retaliation. The discourse about small.
I wasn't trying to.
No. But I'm trying to address the point, right? So we need to keep in mind, and that's actually a problem. Each camp in nuclear strategizing assumes that they have the last word. You know, the Russian camp will say, we escalate to de-escalate, we use the tactical nuance, and then it ends. Then, you know, the West will say, so I spent part of my summer at Stanford where I talked to essentially let's say, the nuclear strategists on the democratic side who see themselves as moderate. And what they say is, we wouldn't respond with nuclear weapons. And like, okay, but you would respond how? We would respond with conventional strikes on the Russian mainland. But same thing, they assume that their action ends. Whereas, you know, this is essentially an assumption of controlling the escalation ladder to your benefit, which I find to be very optimistic. There is an element also, if you're asking about nuclear risk in Russia. Let me see if I have a slide on this. I think I do. So the one thing I wanted to emphasize is that there's a lot of conversation suggesting, oh, the precedents are reassuring because we have nuclear weapon states that lost wars without using those weapons. So that's correct. You know, true for the US in several instances, true for the Soviet Union. But that would be incorrect to say we do not have a precedent of a leader that said humiliating defeat is worse than death. If you're not familiar with it, I recommend that you go read the letter that Fidel Castro sent to Nikita Khrushchev on the 26th of October of 1962, where he literally says, the imperialists, i.e. the United States, are going to bomb or invade within a few days. Literally, the regime is dead. If the regime is dead, I'm asking you to start nuclear war on our behalf, so that at least the regime will have died for something. So we have leaders who consider that, you know, essentially there are things that are worse than death. let's not get reassured too quickly on that one. And let's also remember that there is a June 2020 document signed by Mr. Putin setting conditions for use of tactical nuclear weapons, in which he says if the existence of the Russian state is at stake, which he keeps claiming this conflict is all about. Yeah. So they're opening a path for it.
Thank you for a really interesting lecture. I'm curious, I mean, one of the most striking things from your talk, in my understanding of it, was the paucity of imagination when it comes to all this in terms of actually imagining nuclear futures in which weapons are deployed. Yep. And from my background in climate change, it's that, you know, presentations of climate change, imaginative presentations, have done a lot of work in getting people to mobilize around it. Obviously, the challenge with nuclear war is there's not incremental versions of it. It kind of either happens or doesn't, as opposed to climate change, which is more and more rapidly unfolding, but relatively slowly unfolding right now. So who in your work do you come across who actually maybe is doing a good example of work that helps people imagine these futures? Or what do you think is necessary to develop infrastructures to have more robust imaginations of nuclear war to get leaders to take it more seriously? Fabulous question.
Yeah, thank you. I'll respond in 3 steps. One is we've done work on that from one angle, which is visual popular culture. And we've documented that throughout the decades of the Cold War, from the 50s onwards, there are 4 aesthetic gestures that allowed viewers to overcome their disbelief. So that allowed viewers to be in a world in which nuclear weapons related disasters were conceivable. The bad news is, to just answer briefly, bad news is those 4 aesthetic gestures have disappeared post-Cold War. The post-Cold War visual popular culture not only no longer helps us overcome our disbelief in the possibility of nuclear disaster, but it reinforces this disbelief. In the post-Cold War visual popular culture, you have only a few explosions, never a possibility of retaliation. Nuclear war is a thing of the past. The beginning of nuclear war is detached from human origin. Only machines or cyborgs would start nuclear war. Sometimes the effects are massively minimized. I'm going to give you 3 quick examples. For the James Cameron fan in the room, if you remember the end of True Lies, at the end of True Lies, there is a nuclear explosion. What it does is that it provides the sunset, the lighting for the romantic kiss among the 2 heroes. So complete neutralization, right? It's just a lamp, literally. But more recently, same effect, The Dark Knight Rises. All you have to do is detonate the thing far enough from Gotham City, and then you can have coffee with Michael Caine in the next scene. Or third example, in World War Z, there is this one moment when Brad Pitt in a helicopter flies over a mushroom cloud. It's inconvenient. He loses cell phone communication. And then obviously there is our dear Indiana Jones, right? All you have to do to survive a nuclear blast is be in a fridge. So you see, those are the modes of minimization. Then there is the reversal, which is nuclear weapons in post-Cold War popular culture are treated as irreplaceable instruments of salvation. Think about Pacific Rim, or think about all the asteroid kind of movies, where even when NASA tells you, we would not nuke the asteroids, that wouldn't work, and we have better plans. Hollywood doesn't care. In Hollywood, you have an asteroid, you nuke it. You have aliens, they resist everything, you nuke them. You have monsters from under the sea, they resist everything, you nuke them. Most important kind of reversal, Godzilla. Originally, what is Godzilla? The symbolic manifestation of the effects of nuclear testing, right? Godzilla is the monstrous outcome of nuclear testing. In the 2010s, Godzilla shows up and you know what to do. So that's, how we are in a difficult position in terms of visual popular culture. The So that was my second point. During the Cold War, we were helped by popular culture. Post-Cold War, we're not. To your question, what is done now nicely is the work by colleagues Moritz Kütt and Sharon Weiner called the Nuclear Biscuit, which is essentially a simulation of you being the president of the United States in a crisis situation. Maybe also the work in virtual reality called In the Morning You Wake, which gets people to think about what happened in Hawaii in 2018. And we have an artist in residence. Her name is Juliette Séjourné. What she's doing is creating an installation to redo the Hashimoto video that you may have seen, the 15-minute video that just shows all the tests over time. But the problem is that this video is dated, missed some data, misses all the cases of luck, doesn't include Israel, doesn't distinguish between underground and above ground. So what Juliette is doing is she's turning this into an installation so you can actually walk over essentially a planet that has suffered from nuclear testing. But there's much more to be done. One last maybe observation on this, which is an invitation for those, if we're thinking about artists intervening. One surprising finding in this study is that when we surveyed respondents about which artifact shaped your view, we expected to find a lot of Terminator, War Games, and Doctor Strangelove. We found some of it, but much less than Threads and The Day After. TV movies, by, with all due respect, relatively minor directors compared to Stanley Kubrick. And so we were like, what do those movies do that the others don't? And I think the one thing that they do is that they deny cathartic relief. That is, in nuclear popular culture, at the end, you either have the relief of, it didn't happen, we're safe, or the joy, I mean, Herman Kahn would call it orgasm, of the end of the world. The Day After and Threads denies that. The Day After and Threads do not allow you to close the door between the viewing moment and your world. They are haunting experiences. There are moments where at the end you just have a few survivors entirely lost in the fog. And they kind of look like you. So I think this haunting effect and the denial of the relief is what makes the impact. So my advice would be for the artist to mobilize that kind of effects. Sorry, that was long, but I really want to look for an answer to that question.
So thanks so much. I was much struck by your account of the non-inevitability of proliferation. But for me, your presentation took a kind of unexpected left turn when you moved from your scholarly expert rescoping analysis to the prescription for additional public participation. And that's because I tend to assume that democratization of catastrophic risk management of rare risks presents a set of special challenges. So there's a great article on this, The Tragedy of the Uncommons, by Jonathan Weiner, who happens to be sitting next to me. I would actually be recommending the article regardless. But the basic, he may correct me, but the basic takeaway is that there's a set of psychological heuristics and political forces that make risk perception of uncommon catastrophes particularly fraught, and that this is a reason that we may need to rely especially heavily on experts. And I guess I would just add to that when we have again a technical expert rescoping analysis like this one, it just strikes me that that's the sort of thing that we would expect experts to take account of, and perhaps not the public. So I don't. Maybe I missed a step, or maybe we just disagree about the appropriate role of the public here. But
no. So thank you for this point. I don't think we disagree, because my point is not to say remove the experts. My point is to say, in the nuclear weapons realm, the experts are not in a position to play the beneficial role that you want them to play, because they're accepting too many assumptions that by default validate existing policies. So what I'm essentially saying is that, sure, experts should do two things: provide a set of options and consistent justifications with what is being done, which in that realm is not the case today. So my point is definitely not to get rid of the experts, but to place them in a position where they can meaningfully play that role.
And then maybe the next question is just whether that means experts should do better, or whether we should abandon experts and move to the public, and maybe just experts need to listen to you.
No, I mean, no, really the point, I mean, I wouldn't be saying experts need to listen to me, but I would say the structure of the field has flaws, which I try to document by saying the funding flaws create biases. The fact that they incorporate categories of official courses essentially consolidate those biases, and then they produce too limited a set of alternatives. So whether they want to listen to me or not, they should actually become capable to offer a set of alternatives that are consistent with what is being deployed and be accountable in some fashion for what they propose.
Thank you, Benoît. And since Arden took my question, but let me ask a further question about your view of the experts' overconfidence. Mm-hmm. The sense I got, but correct me if I was not following accurately, the sense I got was that your argument is that today experts are overconfident, or the policymakers, including in the national security establishment, are overconfident in the impossibility of unwanted nuclear explosions, right? But that, now let me add, and see if you agree with this, that back in the 1960s, the general critique was that experts were overconfident in the usability of nuclear weapons, and that only mutually assured destruction through massive retaliation would deter nuclear war, although Dr. Strangelove is a critique of the non-credibility of massive retaliation. And I think you mentioned Herman Kahn a few minutes ago. So my understanding is that Herman Kahn's argument was we need to not assume that either nuclear weapons would be used or that nuclear retaliation, massive retaliation, would deter nuclear war, but understand more credible steps in an escalation ladder, which would, by demonstrating the ability to so-called win a nuclear war, would thereby deter nuclear war. So are you arguing that these experts, or this community of not necessarily a single viewpoint of experts, has switched from overconfidence in the use to overconfidence in the non-use of nuclear weapons? And if that's true, why did that? Was it the end of the Cold War or something else that caused that? And how can a more nuanced, more strategic view be achieved?
Okay, so thank you for the question. Very quickly, an answer in two ways. One is, there are multiple traditions on what Daniel Dudney calls the nuclear political question. And what you're pointing at is essentially moments in which one tradition was winning over another, and that's what switched. But the one thing I want to clarify is essentially my point about experts. In chapter 6 of the book, I emphasize 3 sources of overconfidence in the impossibility of unwanted nuclear explosions. In one of them is official experts' inability to give a complete picture of past nuclear disasters. Why is that? So I'm going to specify that claim. One reason is that the official rhetoric of deterrence, which official experts practice, is a rhetoric of protection. And it turns out that they all know that since the coupling of thermonuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, protection is no longer possible. So the discourse of deterrence as protection already overlooks the reality of vulnerability and the fact that the practice of deterrence is trading in vulnerabilities. in space vulnerabilities. The second bit is that there is an expected performative effect of the deterrence discourse, which prevents semi-official experts from expressing its limits of validity, and this is the one moment where I'm going to be French. One of the great French strategists, Lucien Poirier, wrote it very clearly, manifesting our skepticism about the credibility of deterrence. It's playing the adversary's hand. So by definition, as an expert, if you knew limits of safety, limits of control, limits of credibility, you are expected not to say. And therefore, that alone shuts down multiple possibilities. There is more scholarship that shows that technicians of nuclear war, including workers at nuclear weapons labs, manage to convince themselves that it will never happen through what anthropologist Hugh Gustafson calls the central axiom, which literally treats nuclear weapons as perfectly tameable technologies. And then we have, very briefly, an example where even ICBM launch officers, when they are asked, end up showing massive cognitive dissonance and talking as though nothing will ever happen. So those are the types of modes of overconfidence that I'm pushing against, and that was actually absent in the presentation, and it's because in my argument about luck, the point is to say, in some instances, what avoided unwanted nuclear explosions is not practices of control, but it's sometimes variables independent from control practices, or it's thanks to the failure of control practices that we've avoided that. And those experts, because of the position they're in, they couldn't possibly say, because professionally they simply cannot. I actually have additional evidence of that, but I want to, let's continue this if you have time.
Yeah, I think we should continue it. We will continue it for those that are willing to join us in the pub afterwards. We're going to reconvene in the Granta. But before I say that, I wanted to say that I think experts should listen to you, Benoît. I don't think you should deny that truth. I should also say that you haven't answered my question about sleeping at night, which I want you to answer in the pub. And those of us that are able to join us, then please do so at the Granta. But in the meantime, I'd like you to join me in thanking Benoît for his lecture and answers.
Thank you.